The only objective for this module is to outline the mechanisms of gene expression. We will be looking at fundamental genetics and exploring a little bit more in depth Mendel's experiments and a contribution to our understanding of inheritance. Before going in depth on the inheritance of our behavior, we have to look at some fundamental genetics. Looking at these terms in here, you can see that each specific term has a brief description at the bottom. We'll start off with looking at genes, which is basically genetic material composed of DNA. These are arranged on chromosomes, and we know that this is inherited from our parents. Each gene carries a code to manufacture a specific protein, and these proteins in turn influence our observable physical and psychological traits. As we look at the chromosomes, you'll know that these are slender threads inside a cell's nucleus, and these basically carry a gene. When we look at a cell's nucleus, we're talking about the inside. There is a very tightly knit thread that basically carries the code for what you and I would look like. And it is an impressive 3 billion base pair code that we see. This, of course, gives way to our genetic makeup, and that's what we call our genotype. However, please note that our genotype isn't necessarily shown. For example, my grandma from my father's side had hazel color eyes, and neither does my dad, nor do I have hazel color eyes. However, it is possible, it is likely that even though I do not have hazel color eyes, it may be in my genotype. I may be the carrier of that gene. My phenotype, which is my observable trait, shows that I have dark brown eyes. However, if I should ever have kids, and I have a child who has hazel eyes, I should not be too concerned because it would make sense as it may be in my genotype, just not in my phenotype. And so this gives way to the two types of genes we have. We have dominant genes and we have recessive genes. A dominant gene simply masks the other gene's effects. For example, brown eyes tend to be more dominant than blue eyes or green eyes. Recessive gene would be a gene that is only expressed in the absence of a dominant gene. And so blue eyes and green eyes can only be expressed if there's another recessive gene associated with it. But if there's a dominant gene and a recessive gene, the dominant will always get its way and become part of our phenotype. As you remember our introduction to this chapter, monk Gregory Mendel from Austria has been influential in our understanding of genetics and inheritance. Mendelian genetics basically come from in establishing these two important components. We have either dichotomous traits or true breeding lines. Now, what a dichotomous trait is traits that occur in one form or the other, but never in combination. So a brown-eyed human that has either brown or blue traits from parents would actually have both of the genes that would be in the genotype, but the phenotype, because of the dominance, would likely be that of the brown color. Whereas with true breeding lines, we would actually see an interbreeding of members that always produce offspring with the same trait. For example, blue-eyed couples, meaning that there is a heterosexual couple, a male and a female, that both have blue eyes, they are always going to produce offspring with the same trait. Mendel studied the inheritance of pea plants' seed color, in this case brown and white. He began by crossbreeding the offspring of a line of pea plants that had bred true for brown seeds with the offspring of a line of pea plants that had bred true for white seeds. These were the dichotomous traits, as explained in the previous slide. The offspring of this cross all had brown seeds, just like you see here in this particular case. Then Mendel bred these first generation offspring with another. And so we see this particular example here. And he found that about 3/4 of the resulting second generation offspring had brown seeds, which were the dominant traits. It was only 25% of them, about 1/4, that had white seeds. These were the recessive traits. And you can see in here that the W indicates the recessive trait. More specifically, you can see that a capital letter would indicate that it is a dominant trait, and the lowercase letter would indicate that it is a recessive trait. Here, the first one you see that has brown color seeds is made up of two dominant traits in here, brown and brown. The second one that also has brown color seeds is made up of one dominant brown trait and the other one that's a recessive white. The third that has brown seeds also has a dominant brown and a recessive white. And then the one that ends up with the white color has two recessive traits. Mendel repeated this experiment many times with various pairs of dichotomous pea plant traits, and each time the result was the same. The dominant trait appeared in all of the first generation offspring. The recessive trait appeared in about 1/4 of the second generation offspring. To illustrate the point of genotype and phenotype, please note that while the phenotype of this one is that of brown seeds, it is also its genotype, and it does not carry any recessive traits. However, this one, although the phenotype is brown, it is the carrier of a recessive trait. Therefore, although the phenotype is brown, the genotype would also have the white recessive gene. Same thing with this one. While the phenotype, observable characteristics, is brown, it too carries a recessive gene. So its genotype is made up of both. Should these two ever be crossed with each other, they would have very similar results or similar offspring to this right here, whereas about 75% of them would have brown seeds, and 25% of those would have recessive traits. As stated earlier, you and I have genes that have been inherited from our biological parents, and then they inherited that from their parents, and so forth. We continue going down the line. Now, genes are located on chromosomes inside the nucleus of each cell. And so as we look at the cell of our saliva, or of cells in our hearts and cells that make up our skin, we would find that we would have a same makeup of 23 pairs of chromosomes. Now, as we go into chromosomes, please note that the number of chromosomes is very important. And so as in humans, we have 23 pairs. Monkeys, apes, and chimps have 24 pairs. A lion actually has 38 pairs of chromosomes. Strawberries have 14 pairs of chromosomes. Fruit flies have 8 pairs of chromosomes. And chromosomes are, as stated earlier, a thread-like structure of nucleic acid and protein that's found in the nucleus of most living cells. This carries genetic information in the form of genes. And we find that in there, we also have alleles. And we find that there's one allele in each chromosome. Now, the alleles that control each trait are situated at the same location, one on each chromosome of a particular pair. And so we find that two genes that control the same trait, for example, eye color, are called alleles. One gene is provided by each parent, but they don't have to be the same color from each. And so we start having what we call homozygous and heterozygous alleles. Homozygous, basically two identical alleles, for example, having two recessive traits like blue and blue eyes, or having two dominant traits like brown and brown eyes, whereas heterozygous would be two different alleles where we would have brown eyes and blue eyes. And so these genes right here would control the same trait, which would be the eye color of the individual. Once again, please note that there is one allele on each chromosome, and alleles are those genes that control the same trait. In this case, we're focusing on eye color, but it could also be hair, whether it's curly or not, shape of your face, whether it's round or elongated, and any other physical traits. For the purpose of keeping you focused on the psychology course, please be reminded that these traits, physical traits, are not limited to only appearance, but also to our behavior. And so we will be looking as to how this information of reproduction and recombination can also help us understand behavior. If you have siblings and you're like me, oftentimes you may be asked when you hang out with your sister or brother, maybe if you guys are even a couple. My sister and I look very different from each other. Whereas my sister is more fair-skinned and I'm not so much. We, as far as we've been told, we come from the exact same parents. The reason why we do not look alike and why various siblings look so different from each other can be explained by meiosis. Meiosis is a process of diploid cell division that produces gametes. Now, what we mean by diploid is we're talking about a cell that has 46 chromosomes. As we stated earlier, your heart cells, your skin cells, your liver cells, saliva, they all have the same chromosomes. However, meiosis also produces gametes, which are cells with just 23 chromosomes. And examples of gametes would be egg and sperm. Imagine if, as you may already know, when your parents conceived you, mom provided 23 chromosomes and dad provided 23. Had they each provided 46, which is what we find in the rest of our cells, we would look very different. As stated earlier, looking at monkeys that have 24 chromosomes and lions that have 38, part of their genotype and phenotype is influenced by the amount of chromosomes. So we know that having these gametes that eventually become one, and they become a diploid, is the reason why, that's the beginning of the reason why we look so different from our siblings. Now, the first stage of meiosis, and there are several stages and you do not need to know them, is basically that chromosomes line up in pairs. Typically, they tend to be attracted to the chromosome that looks like them. So you'll find the first chromosome looks very similar to the first chromosome of your mom's, and the second chromosome of your dad looks very similar and pairs up with the second chromosome that looks very similar. But there's typically an exception when we get to the 23rd pair. If it is a female, the female ends up with XX, that's the sex chromosomes. But if it is a male, we end up with XY. And while XX looks similar, they're both elegant and beautiful and long. When we look at our Y chromosome of males, that is a short, not so nice chromosome. And that would be the exception to chromosomes lining up in pairs. Now, members of each pair cross over one another at random points, and they break apart at random points of contact and exchange sections. And we believe it is this random division of cell and genetic recombination that contributes to genetic diversity composed by mom and dad. More specifically, as stated earlier, as my sister and I are told that we come from the same parents but look so different from each other, we know that this can be explained by the random cell division and the random recombination and the points at which they made contact that exchanged sections. We'll talk about this a little bit more in future slides. Although mitosis and meiosis sound alike, please note that whereas meiosis produces gametes, which are basically cells that end up with just 23 chromosomes, mitosis is a form of cell division that yields daughter cells that have 23 pairs of chromosomes. Again, meiosis just has 23 chromosomes, whereas mitosis is the process through which all 23 pairs of chromosomes are constantly replacing what you and I lose. So mitosis is responsible for a lot of key functions in our body. When we get our hair cut, even though we may shave it completely, it is the code in our chromosomes that determines that our hair will grow back in the same fashion. For example, if I have curly hair and I want it to be straight, I cannot just shave it off and hope for it to grow back differently, because there's a code and mitosis is responsible for it. It is also whenever I cut if I get a cut in my hand, if I get a cut somewhere in my body, mitosis basically provides the code that allows my skin to be regenerated in a way that's consistent with my skin color for the most part. Whenever we have damaged a particular organ, mitosis also helps us heal from that. And so when we got to replace cells, those cells that have been damaged, mitosis comes to the rescue. But unfortunately, mitosis also can have a role in our tumors, if any. If hopefully we don't have any tumors, but if individuals that have tumors, mitosis also contributes to the tumor growing because it recognizes it sadly as one of its cells, and it continues the process. Please note, as a recap of this in here, gametes are these haploid cells that only have 23 chromosomes, whereas when we look at diploid cells, they have 23 pairs of chromosomes. When an egg and a sperm combine, they basically form a zygote, and so 23 pairs of chromosomes are present when this occurs. DNA is considered to be the most complicated molecule that exists. It is very complex, and it wasn't until about 60 years ago that we learned what it looked like. And that is what you may have heard of as the double helix. It is a very amazing shape that looks like a twisted ladder, and this is basically the DNA where we store all our genetic instructions. As stated earlier, there's a 3 billion letter code that provides a blueprint, so to speak, assembly instructions for everything that you are. The shape of your nose, the shape of your lips, whether you have a lot of hair, whether you don't have a lot of hair, and everything that you and I are is made up of this in here. The DNA is coiled very tightly inside chromosomes, and the DNA is made up of genes which store genetic code. Combinations of these genetic code makes alleles, which is an alternate form of a gene, and this is what's responsible for the inheritance of specific traits. Now, when we look at these double strands of nucleotide bases that are wrapped around each other, we know that there are 4 nucleotides, and a nucleotide on strand 1 always pairs up with a particular nucleotide on strand 2. And the nucleotides that we know are right here: adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine. And adenine will always pair up with thymine, and guanine will always pair up with cytosine. But these 3 billion base pair codes basically could be like AT, ATT, ATA, AT, GC, CG, or it could be CG, GC, AT, TA, CG, GC, but they'll always pair up with one another. So the sequence of these bases on each chromosome constitute what is known as your genetic code. The genetic code, again, makes alleles, and that gives way to what you and I will look like, our very specific traits. Mitosis is made possible by replication of the chromosomes. And the DNA replication basically is as the 2 strands of the original DNA molecule unwind, and this is your DNA right here. There are 4 nucleotide bases that you see here: adenine, guanine, thymine, and cytosine. And these 4 nucleotide bases on each strand attract free-floating complementary bases. And so you could see right here this unwinding. It was 1 right here, and then it starts unwinding, and it will start then attracting something that will pair up with it. So you will always see a T in that form, or it could be TA. You will see CG, or it could be GC, but they will always be with each other. And these now are 2 identical DNA molecules that are being created. And so the replication process continues. The DNA is composed of these carbon sugar molecules. that basically are on each side right here. And each of these nucleotides are made up of nitrogen bases. And these are the chromosomes that basically make up who you and I are. Now, chromosome 1 is the single largest chromosome that contains 247 base pairs. And we find that on each cell has more than 22 pairs of chromosomes and with their respective base pairs. So combined, each cell contains 3 billion base pairs. And this is pretty impressive because, again, this is what gives way to who you and I are. Unfortunately, chromosomal errors are sometimes inevitable. Down syndrome, a genetic disorder caused by the presence of all or part of a third copy of chromosome 21, is known as trisomy 21 or trisomy 21, which basically means that there's a third chromosome in there. There should have only been two, but there is a third one in there, and this brings about some very obvious changes in the appearance of an individual. Mutations are also chromosomal errors, and these are considered accidental alterations in individual genes. Whereas most mutations disappear because they do not represent an advantage for individuals, beneficial mutations can be found throughout the natural world. Remember, a mutation is a change in your DNA, more specifically a mutation that allows your DNA to create a protein that functions differently than it otherwise would. Now, in humans, scientists have uncovered a recent mutation in the receptor proteins of the cell membrane. People possessing this mutation, though there are few of them, have shown a resistance to HIV. This is due to the inability of the virus to bind correctly to the host cell. Another example of beneficial mutation in humans is our rich color vision. Humans have what's known as trichromatic vision, meaning that we can discriminate between three colors, red, green, and blue. Many animals have dichromatic or monochromatic vision, and they lack the ability to perceive all the colors we can. This ability to see multiple colors is likely the result of a beneficial mutation that occurred in our DNA several million years ago. As we stated earlier, chromosomes tend to pair up with another chromosome that looks like them. But the exception to the rule comes with the 23rd pair. And that's the sex chromosomes, which may look different and carry different genes, specifically when we look at a male. You see, a female chromosomes would be two elegant X chromosomes that look like that, whereas a male would probably look like this. The X being the larger one, rich, elegant piece in here, whereas the male would be our Y right here, a short, not so pleasant, wrinkled chromosome. Now, sex-linked traits are traits that are influenced by genes on the sex chromosomes. So we're looking specifically at the 23rd pair. And these are the pair of chromosomes that determine individuals' sex, but they also control a few other things. So virtually all sex-linked traits are controlled by X. And you can see why. Again, look at the dominance of this particular chromosome and look at the somewhat impacted, impaired contribution that we as men can do. And I'm being a bit, I'm putting down men a little bit more so on this in here, but please remember that in each chromosome we have alleles and that they each contribute to a particular gene, and if this in fact is contributing much more to that, then we start seeing that the Y may be inhibited by it. And so because of that, all sex-linked traits virtually are controlled by the X chromosome genes because the Y chromosome is small and carries few genes. The dominant traits on the X chromosome will be seen more commonly in females, whereas the recessive ones will be seen more so in males. And this is due to the XX configuration, which would be this right here. Please note that recessive linked traits are manifested only in females who possess two of the recessive genes, one on each chromosome. It's kind of like looking back at the blue eyes and brown eyes. You see, the only way that the blue eye can be manifested on the offspring is if there are two recessive genes. But if there's just one dominant trait, which is again on the X, then this one here would not be shown at all. And so recessive sex-linked traits are manifested in all males who possess the gene, and that is because there is only one X chromosome. The classic example of recessive sex-linked trait is color blindness, and that is because the color blindness gene is quite rare. Females almost never inherit two of them, and thus almost never possess the disorder. In contrast, every male who possesses one color blindness gene is colorblind. Please note that for the sake of simplicity, I'm referring to a colorblind gene, but this is not strictly a true description. There's a lot more detailed information on the genetics of color vision deficiency, but it is linked to the 23rd chromosome pair.